Some technical difficulties. Sorry about that. I had to switch computers. All right, I'm Harold Love Jr., and I serve as a state representative here in Nashville, Tennessee, but also serve as the pastor of Lee Chapel AME Church here in Nashville also. I've been elected since 2012 to serve in that district. Been pastoring for 21 years now. And one of the things that I always was thinking about as I was in the ministry and looking to go into public service was what was the role of the Black church when it came to public policy. And the one thing that always was on my mind was the historical role of the Black church in public policy. When you talk about Jim Crow laws and Black codes, you talk about the role the Black church played and how that was seemingly the only institution that was able to solve many of the social ills at the time, particularly when you look at the civil rights movement and how so many leaders came out of the Black church. And oftentimes the Black church was a meeting place to organize for these protests and for these events. So the question that comes up, what happens in a post-civil rights era? What happens in an era after civil rights acts have been passed, the legislation has been passed? What happens when we now deal in 2020 with public policy that seems to not always reflect the best of what Black people want? Yet you have an increased number of elected officials, you have increased opportunities to vote, but it seems as if nothing has changed. So what role does the Black church play in that? And so one thing I consider was the fact that we must talk about what it means to really be engaged in the governing process. And so every citizen has different reasons why they engage in the governing process. Some engage in the process because they feel as though they are obligated to engage in the process. Some engage in the process because they want to see particular laws or policies change. So then it begs the question, what role does the Black church play in helping shape policy? What role does the Black church play in helping look at whether those citizens are having enough information and informed enough to deal with these policy changes? So citizen participation is a very important thing, and it is, I think, very crucial to this conversation about what it means for the Black church to be involved in public policy. And of course, participation can range from those who vote on election day and then never again come back and engage the process until the next election. Or it can be citizens who engage the process, but also will engage after the election, who attend town hall meetings, who attend school board meetings, who may show up at Capitol Hill and go into committee meetings. These are different levels of citizen participation. And these models rely on the belief that the role of the citizen is to ensure that those who've been elected don't trample upon the rights of those who elected them. Participation also requires that citizens hold themselves accountable and don't just vote for elected officials and then walk away and don't come back to the next election. So then we ask the question, well, what role then does the Black church play in this particular citizen participation model? Being a member of a church seems to have a transformative effect upon a person who might otherwise think that their circumstances are allowing them to choose not to be politically active. And there's something, compelling about religion, something compelling about being engaged in the process outside of the sermons that are preached, but being in those communities, being in those neighborhoods where you oftentimes see the effects of bad public policy being enacted upon those citizens of that community. And so religion is not utilized to focus attention on the world beyond, but also the world under our feet. It focuses on the fact that policy makers must be engaged and they must hear from those who are seeking to have their issues and concerns heard. So then the issue of religion in political activity allows African Americans to conceptualize the reality of transforming with, through, and by their actions, because they see it's been done before. And so this is why the Black church is so important and so crucial to public policy, because it allows it to be a motivator as it relates to providing a template for how the community is viewed. Give an example, the Black church in healthcare. All right, so the Black church is one of the very few organizations outside of major healthcare organizations that can help provide policy change in the African American community. the Black church can push for affordable, good quality health care that has historically been denied to this community. Take a look at what's happening right now in most of our major cities. All across our cities, we're having people being tested for COVID-19. Right here in Nashville, Tennessee, Meharry Medical College is leading the charge for COVID-19 testing. But they found also that a partnership with the Black church would allow them to use the church grounds as a means for cars to pull up with a drive-through testing center. And this is a very practical way in which the Black church is changing public policy. And so some may say, well, that's not changing laws. Yeah, but policy is not just about changing laws. It's also about changing the way that laws are applied, also about changing the way that laws are carried out. And so what we have in a health crisis is if you have high numbers of African Americans who are not being tested, if you have high number of African Americans that don't feel safe going to other areas to be tested, here is where we have evidence that the Black church engages in the process and says, use our facilities, use our parking lots to have drive-through facilities and allow the testing of those in the community to have a record of their tests coming back, them feeling safe and them feeling secure about the facility in which they are being tested. And so that's one way to use the Black church in the area of healthcare. Another way is to use the Black church and apply this disconnect we oftentimes have. There are health fairs that oftentimes held at churches, but very often we do not ask the question about what are the most prevalent health issues in that particular church. So we have students, we have practitioners who oftentimes come in and ask for the ability to have a health care at a church, but who does the study before they come with the health fair to find out, is this health fair around heart attack and stroke going to be more effective, or should we have one around diabetes and cancer? So we need to also have health screenings in our church to find out what are the prevalent health conditions that need to be addressed so those health fairs can be more effective and also that the members of the church feel that their voice is being heard. Another area in which the Black church can help affect public policy is the issue around education. The African American church, with the individual leader of that church, has oftentimes occupied a position of authority in the church, in the community. But we also skip over this issue of how do we address issues of education. And among the many challenges that we have in our community is this issue of education. And the considerable power of the African American church can be leveraged to bring about policy change in education. Well, we know that the issue of Brown versus Board of Education was birthed out of the fact that the young lady who was being forced to get on a bus to go to a school far away from her, where she had one close to walk, her parents were a member of a Black church. And they found the ability to leverage the power of the church to bring about social change in education. Other issues, we don't oftentimes talk about the achievement gaps between African American students and other students. And so when we tout educational gains, we don't look at the disconnect between African American gains. Here is where the church can come right in and the church can be an advocate for those students. Now, the problem is this: oftentimes individual churches will have after school programs, individual churches will have summer camps, but there's no collective means for churches to come together and say, how can we collectively work to bring about change in the educational system? How can we collectively talk about unfair funding in all of our schools? How can we collectively look at ways to bring about change for all of our students? We have to have a situation where we view change in educational policy as just as paramount as change in healthcare policy as African American churches. It allows us to then view education as a civil rights issue and have an honest assessment of whether there is racial bias and discrimination in the school system. We talk about the fact that, like here in Nashville, a few years back, we had elementary school students and kindergartners who were suspended and put out of school. 100% of those elementary school students were African American males. This is a perfect example for the Black church to engage in having policymakers ask the question of what are the measures by which you will expel a student? What criteria are you using? And this is how we leverage the power of the Black church to transform education policy and to have the voice of those members of that church heard. The Black church can impress upon education officials the need for African American students to be seen as more than empty bank accounts waiting for the teacher or administrator to deposit something in them. The student brings to the school their own unique experiences, and if given the chance, can create a shared learning environment where everyone benefits. The student benefits from having the chance to prepare themselves for a world that is different from the one they live in, and the teacher benefits from having a student who is engaging and desires to learn and share. The school setting may be the only place where many of the students can have an image of a better future as possible, but they cannot be made to feel ashamed of where they are born, the zip code they are born in, or the particular way that they talk. And African American students, come to school with the need to learn, and also consideration for the fact that some of them may be experiencing trauma in their neighborhoods or homes, and we have to change our school discipline policies to reflect that. That teachers need to be aware of adverse childhood experiences and make provisions for that in their discipline policies. Also, they need to understand that when a child may be sleeping in the classroom, it's not because the child is disinterested, but the child may have had something go on in the home the night before and comes to school as an escape, but doesn't need to be penalized for those situations. It's a mistake for educators and school leaders to juxtapose English as the only major form of communication when we have other ways to communicate, right? And our students don't need to be forced to code switch that they take on a dialect when they come to school versus when they use in the neighborhood. So the Black church has this opportunity to look at how education is being taught in our school system and argue for this point for our students. Now, with all these opportunities to talk about Black church engagement in healthcare, Black church engagement in education, we must also consider that there are barriers to the Black church being engaged. One major barrier are the power struggles in the church. We oftentimes talk about this, but there are power struggles. So when one knows that this very unique institution has all this opportunity to bring about change and to talk about how policy can be changed, the question has to be asked, who is going to be in control in the church when it comes to this issue? So someone may want to have an after-school program, but because somebody else did not think of it, then someone else may then put a stop to it. Or someone else may be the deterrent to seeing the program really be fully supported. And these are situations we really must talk about, because different views of how the church should address the non-spiritual needs of the community can oftentimes bring about contention within the church, not just outside the church, but within the church. And even beyond different views of these issues, there are also power struggles in the church when it comes to who's going to make the decision and about the budget issues. And so we talk about the budget of the church, how much we want to spend on these programs. Oftentimes, if the program is not directly related to what's going on in the church, there may be those who refuse to engage in the process of funding those initiatives. So we talk about power struggles in the church. Another barrier is whether people think that the church should even be engaged in this process. How oftentimes have we heard that this is not what the church should be doing, right? That the church leaders should not be out there protesting, and the church leaders should not be out there writing op-eds and getting involved in these processes. But then you must ask the question, are we to not engage in reducing crime? Are we not to engage in increasing education opportunities? Are we not to engage in increasing healthcare for the members of the church and the community around which the church is situated? These are opportunities for people to say, if this is our mission, then Sunday school has to be just as important as reducing crime. Sunday worship has to be just as important as increased education opportunities. Wednesday night Bible study has to be just as important as making sure that our children have equitable funding in their schools. We have to make these issues just as important as any other issues. So now, we look at different ways and varieties of how people will engage in the process. And this oftentimes speaks to church mission. All right. So if the church doesn't have in their mission that these are the things that they're going to engage in, oftentimes it's hard to make that particular point to those who are going to be involved in the process. And so we think about the issues, again, with COVID-19, the issue with racial justice, and oftentimes elected official, we make the statement that the budget is a moral document, that the budget has to reflect the views and the values of our constituencies. And this is where the church, again, can engage in the process and help remove those barriers when it comes to the issue of how do we engage in the process. So I think someone's asked the question of, can we speak on denominational tendencies and barriers between cooperation between Black churches, oftentimes we'll find that in your mainline denominations, there may be a tendency for you to engage in the process more because historically that may have been the process that you use to bring about change. You may find that there is a tendency to support these initiatives if you can find that your denomination has historically had a involvement in protest movement, has historically had an involvement in bringing about change. This is easy to do, but if you're in a denomination that does not particularly adhere to that, then you may find a difficulty engaging the process because denominational leaders may not sign off on you doing that particular thing. And that may become difficult because it then juxtapose you against the leader and may cause problems for you in that landscape. So the Black church and public policy is a particular thing that we need to talk about. Someone asked the question, where does lobbying and church intersect, and should the church utilize them? So let me propose this to you, that we start to view engaging the process of getting elected officials to change the way that they would view a process or a particular issue as lobbying, right? So you are an interest group. You are a person who wants to see an elected official vote on a particular issue in a certain kind of way. So now, as a church leader, as a church member, you have the right to go down to the Metro Council meeting or to Capitol Hill and express those views. You have the right to email them. You have the right to send them a message via phone. And so then the question becomes, how does the church then engage in the process of lobbying for certain initiatives? Here's an opportunity for the church to say, what does it look like for the church to approach an elected official and say, we're going to have a town hall at our church and invite you to talk to us about the particular issues that are coming up in the next week that you're going to be voting on, or for the church to form a political action committee that would propose certain views on legislation and invite that member also to the town hall. What is the benefit of that? The benefit is the members feel more safe at their church because it's familiar to them. Community members feel more empowered because they're coming to a place where they're familiar with and inviting the elected official in. And then you're on your own home turf and you're asking them to then address the issues of that particular bill. You now have formed a situation where you are effectively lobbying. You haven't hired a lobbyist, but you're lobbying that elected official to vote for your particular issue because you're an interested citizen. You are engaged in the process of governing, and now you're asking them to consider your perspective. Now, oftentimes what happens is, as I said at the very beginning, citizens will go and vote and then will not really engage the process until the next election. That's a whole year where the Black church can be engaged in the process of hosting town halls. The Black church can be involved in letting members know about important things in helping shape policy. Simple things like this. When the Black church asks people to fill out the census, that's engaging in public policy because we're asking people to be counted. We're asking people to allow themselves to be counted so that then federal dollars that would be brought to that city or that state can be considered because you now know how many people live in a certain zip code. That's engaging in public policy. So the engagement can range from a simple thing of filling out the census to going to vote, to also attending town halls, and even to engaging policymakers in committee meetings. And this is a wonderful opportunity for us to talk about, how do we shape the way that we govern? How do we shape the way that we view our role in governing? And this is why I would challenge us to look at the church in a different way than we have in the last couple of years. It's not just about inviting elected officials to your church to give a campaign speech. It's not just about having them come around during election time, but it's about engaging them in monthly meetings about what policies they want to enact in your community and hold them accountable and being a participant in the governing process. So this is an important, crucial, historical role that the Black church has always played. And I'm simply suggesting that we can re-envision the way we engage policymakers and re-envision the way that we engage policy, because the very truth of the matter is, if we don't engage the policy makers, we will be the victim of policy that is passed without our voice being heard. If we don't engage policymakers and invite them to a place where we feel safe, we won't allow other voices that oftentimes don't get heard to be heard. When we have committee meetings, when we have votes on the floor, they're oftentimes during the day and people are at work. But imagine what it would look like if the Black church were to hold a town hall in the evening and invite those policymakers in. If we were to hold a town hall on a Saturday and invite them to come in and talk about the bills, this empowers our members and also empowers the members in the community, because now they feel as if their voice is being heard. Now, here's the important thing for us also to remember. If we engage policymakers and they don't vote the way we want them to vote, or they still vote the way we want them to vote, and doesn't change the policy, that does not excuse us to give up. I ran for office 4 times. I lost my first 3 times. I didn't give up because I believed that I could be a valuable contributor to our policymaking process. And that's the same way I think we have to engage the process as members of the Black church. We cannot give up because a vote was taken and it wasn't the way we wanted to happen. We can't give up because the policymaker did not vote the way we wanted them to, and then we get upset and walk away. And I was listening to the keynote speaker this morning, and he said a very important thing. Listen, we don't fight for justice, and then if we don't get the outcome, we give up. You know, we fight for justice because it defines who we are as Christians. And so I didn't give up the first time, and also members of the church cannot give up because the policy doesn't go the way you want it to go. And that's where the education process comes in, and talk about the electoral process is not just voting once a year for the president or voting once a year for the governor. It's about voting for the school board member. It's about voting for the judge. It's about voting for the state rep and state senator. It's about voting for the assembly person. It's about voting for the governor and, of course, the president and members of Congress. But the Black church has, again, a unique opportunity to engage policy making when we are able to have a conversation about what does it mean. Maybe it's about writing an op-ed. Maybe it's about writing an article for the newspaper to print. Maybe it's about engaging your particular church leader and asking them what role do they think that they have to play in this. Let me be in full transparency tell you this. My PhD dissertation was about Black church leaders engaging in policymaking processes and whether they viewed liberation theology as something they should use to engage policymaking. And what we found in the process was many church leaders thought they should engage in the process, but they weren't confident that they could because of things like loss of church mission, things like power struggles in the church. And so we got to ask the question, where do we talk about how we can lift our voices and re-engage the policy process? I think it is in the Black church setting. And by that, I mean, not just in the physical setting, but in the spiritual setting of, you can have a town hall in the community center if your church is not large enough to hold it. And again, go back to the issues of how do we increase healthcare access? It's not just talking about holding health fairs, but holding those folks accountable after they have the health fairs, asking them to come back and have a health fair around an issue we want to have. It's about approaching hospitals and saying, how can you talk to us about a community assessment to see what our needs are? So you're not just prescribing healthcare to us, but also you're engaging in the process, asking what we want to see in this process. So I think there's an opportunity for us to look at how, again, we shape the Black church and public policy, how we engage our elected officials, how we use our church leaders to engage the process, and how we also inspire our young people to also see the Black church as the vehicle through which policy change can indeed occur. When we look at the Black church, we can't just see it, again, as a spiritual organization that is only focused on the hereafter, but we have to be concerned about, again, today. We have to be concerned about education and about healthcare and about housing policy. You know, what does it look like for the Black church to be silent when we see our neighborhoods being gentrified? We can do more than just shake our heads and talk about how it's a shame that the neighborhood is being bought up. Well, what about the church buying some property? What about the church getting with other churches and other faith institutions and buying property and re-envisioning what your neighborhood looks like? What's it like for the church to take their property and use it for affordable housing? And also, what does it look like for members of the Black church when you get that zoning ordinance notice that comes in and says that they want to rezone the neighborhood to build these multi-unit houses, to go to the actual zoning and planning meeting and express your discontent with it? These are opportunities for the Black church, again, to come out of the walls of the church and engage public policy engage policymakers. And I'm very confident that we can do this because we have the power to transform our communities. We have the power to make our community look like we want it to look like. We have the power to engage education policymakers and again, talk about how we don't want our children to be suspended and how we want our children to be considered as the bright and young and beautiful folks that they are. We had the opportunity to talk about healthcare and about housing and of course about crime reduction. You know, what's it look like for Black church members to actually have that conversation maybe with some of the members of the gangs who might ordinarily be criminalized in the neighborhood and show them the love of God, but more than that, talk about how they can transform their lives while simultaneously engaging policymakers about how unjust it is to have these drug-free school zones that are oftentimes going into 2 and 3 in the morning in an effort to trap our young men and young ladies in a situation where they double or triple their sentences just because we are enacting policy that that makes us think that we're making our neighborhood safer when we're really criminalizing and locking our black children up. And so these are opportunities I want us to think about. We talk about the Black church and policy making and shaping. And I come to this perspective, I think, from a very unique point of view, because I've been a pastor again for 21 years and also a policymaker for the last 8 years. And so I always try to marry the intersection of the Black church and public policy. And it's always a curious thing to me about, how we can do this. And I'm living, in a situation where I want to make my community look like a beautiful place and understand that policy is where it's going to be done. And we also engage policymakers to give them support and also inform them about our perspectives and views about these things. And so I want to open up for questions. I see some in the chat room and some things that people have put up, and I want to make room for questions if we have any out there. All right, I don't see any questions, so I certainly will keep on talking then to talk about other issues that we have in the Black church and public policy. Here we are on the eve of an election that will certainly decide who will be in the White House for the next 4 years, and also congressional elections. And we must make sure that as we talk about public policy, that we also think about elections, but don't just stop there. I think one of the worst things we can do is to just vote. And I've said this many times on this broadcast. We can't just vote and then walk away from the ballot box, right? We can't just vote and sit back and say, okay, we elected somebody as president, somebody as governor, and now they are able to change everything. No, it's also about engaging the process throughout the entire whole year and look at ways that we can find solutions to these problems throughout the whole year, right? It's about political education, as the young man said there. It's about us understanding that your vote does matter. And it's about this. When we have people who cannot vote, here's an opportunity for the Black church to now engage them and say, just because you cannot vote because you have a felon on your record does not mean you cannot engage in the process. You can still come to the town hall meetings. You can still come to the committee meetings. You can still engage elected officials about this process, and you can still help folks get elected. You can inform folks about how those particular criminal justice policies affected you. So everybody has a chance to engage in the process. Everybody has, and you're right, we cannot do any of this until we check our classes. You're right. We got to understand that everybody deserves the right to live in a society where they're treated fairly. Everybody has the right to do it. And that's the beauty of the Black church, is the Black church is one of the very few institutions where we have this broad range of people. You have folks who have minimum wage jobs and folks who are making over $100,000 a year in the same church, right? And it's an opportunity to marry those two perspectives and say that we are going to address these issues, and we're collectively going to make sure that people's voices are indeed heard. It's not enough just for us to be members of the same church and then walk away on Sunday, but we got to engage the process, and we got to make sure that we are making sure that people's voices are heard. So the Black church and public policy talks about removing these barriers removing these barriers of engagement, removing the barriers of viewing that this does not line up with the church mission, and remove those barriers of the struggles within the church. One of the unfortunate things about the Black church is that it was one of the very few places where people could have dignity and they could have self-esteem. And so we oftentimes embrace this notion of this is my position in the church, and refuse to work with people to talk about looking at ways to engage the church structure for a myriad of issues. And so we have this unique opportunity in the Black church to do this. And when we do this right, we can find a way to address these issues, and we can see transformation occur all across our landscape. There's a question here, how the Black church can leverage influence through interfaith or interreligious coalition. Yes, that's a wonderful thing that we also need to consider, is how we work with other coalitions. Here in Nashville, we were dealing with this issue of a Confederate bust in the state capitol of Nathan Bedford Forrest. And what we found was we had to work with people outside the Black church. We had to work with members of white churches. We talked about getting them to leverage their privilege to help us with this situation. And so this was a situation where we found a church leader who did not agree with everything that we've been pushing for the whole year, but on this one issue, we could agree. And so we leveraged that relationship and said, since we can agree on this one issue, you take the lead and we'll support you in this. And we found that that was one of the major things we could use, was their own support in this issue and help get the vote, which then start the process to remove the bus from the state capitol. Now, we couldn't have done it by ourselves. And so we got to talk about how we then can leverage our interfaith and interreligious coalitions to bring them other change, but also inform them of the need to listen to our perspectives. And so what we talk about is a question here. If your church was next door to mine, how would you like to see the relation move forward? We can talk about how we view public policy. You know, one of the things we talk about is this. Public policy shapes how Black people are viewed. And I talk about from time to time, public policy oftentimes has devalued the Black body. The Constitution said that we were 3/5 of a person. That automatically devalued the Black body. Federal housing policy, which would not subsidize houses being built for Black folks, but would subsidize housing being built for white people with the assurance they wouldn't sell to Black people, devalued the Black body. The Tuskegee study devalued the Black body. And so we got to use now public policy to raise the value of the Black body in the mind of the population. We know the value of a Black body, but when public policy is passed that devalues the Black body, when public policy is passed that says that the Black school is worth less than the white school, then that devalues the Black education. And so part of the process we have to do when we talk about relationships moving forward is to get assistance in revaluing the Black body and revaluing our Black neighborhoods. And this is where the Black church can play a critical role, because it provides the context by which we say these are our views. It also allows us to, again, have members of the Black church feel comfortable enough to attend these sessions and attend these meetings to talk about what public policy looks like in our neighborhoods. And so we talk about shaping public policy. We talk about the role of the Black church. We cannot, again, miss the opportunity. We can't miss the opportunity to engage persons from all walks of life. Persons who are in our socioeconomic lower class have just as much value in their lives as a person in middle class and upper class. And so unless we address all those issues, then we're still not being a respecter of all persons. We're still not talking about shaping policy that's going to raise the value of everybody's life. And this is very important, because we are at a stage, again, in our society where a good number of people are feeling very apathetic about the public policy process. They feel as if their vote doesn't count. And so they also feel as if the church has been very silent on issues. And this is a chance for us to re-energize the church. And as the summit says, rethink church, and talk about how we would see the church engage in the process of making sure that, again, public policy is not made that tramples upon our rights, and that public policy is not made that devalues our bodies. And this is where we have to engage and make sure that we bring to the forefront also our information and our perspectives, because we are just as informed as anybody else about what's going to affect our communities. Now, I'm telling you, one mistake also is made is this. The mistakes oftentimes is made is public policy makers are prescribing to Black neighborhoods what's best for them. We got to get out of that condition. We have to get out of that position. And now we have to talk about how we want to describe to you what's going on, and also describe to you what we want best, so that you now can help us facilitate our solutions. The prescription process is outdated and it's wrong. And so this is what we talk about even in policing reform. That's why it's so important to have Black leaders and Black church members talking to elected officials about what we want to see in policing reform, instead of having policymakers prescribe to us what reform will look like. So this is the important subject and topics we're talking about now, which is important to our society now. And I can think of no more important time than now to have this discussion about the role of the Black church in shaping public policy, the role of the Black church in also undoing archaic old policy, and the role of public policy, of Black church rather, in making sure that public policy is not going to negatively affect our future, whether it's educational funding and the way that teachers view students, or again, it's healthcare and the way that healthcare is delivered, or it is housing standards and the way that housing is made available and affordable for all residents, and even criminal justice reform. No longer can we have a situation where we stand by and allow public policy again to be negatively affecting our communities and our bodies. And so for me, this is a perfect time for us to talk about this. This is an opportunity for us to look at how we shape it and to go forward. Now, here's what's most important. You also have to give the leaders of the Black churches the courage, right? That when they step out there and take these stances, that they will have support. I've been blessed to have the support of my church, and I can't imagine what it would look like if a church leader steps out there and does not have the support of his membership and his community, or her membership and her community. We have to give them support so that when they step out there and write those op-eds, when they step out there and they are engaged in these protests, when they step out there and they engage these policy officials, they have to know that they have the support behind them, because they're taking a bold step and stance for the rights of everybody in the community. So it's not just about, again, voting. It's not just about going back home after we voted, but it's about being engaged in the process. And let me again reference our speaker this morning. He talked about the fact that it's safe now to drive to a protest and carry our sign and then drive back home. I view it as the same way as folks who just vote and go back home, right? You can't just vote and go back home. You got to vote and engage the process throughout the entire year. You got to hold us accountable, because if you don't, policy is going to be changed the whole year. And then when election time comes around, they're only going to highlight what they did that was beneficial to you. They're never going to talk about what they did that was negatively affecting you. And so you can't just vote and go home. You got to vote and then look for the next meeting. And as a colleague of mine says, a lot of folks want to show up for the game, but won't come to practice. All right. You got to come to practice. So the question is, would I consider an ongoing monthly conversation for the next 12 months? Yeah, because it's what's ingrained in me as a policymaker and as elected official. It's what drives me to do this work, because I can see it from both perspectives, right? I can see it as a church leader and also as a policymaker. And for me, I would be doing a great disservice if I did not make myself available. You got my Facebook and Twitter and Instagram handles, but let me also give my website. It's the same thing. It's haroldlovejr.com. That's my campaign website. My state capital website is also in profile, but I want to give it out there. It's haroldlovejr.com. And you can see my information there. And you can email me. We can talk about this, and also schedule web conversation, because I feel like I'm in a unique position to be able to flesh out, right, what I'm doing. It's one thing for someone to talk about this process, and I'm not lifting myself up as being above anybody else. But what I'm saying is this: I'm doing what I'm talking to you about, right? I am an elected official pastoring a church, and I'm not new to either one of them, right? And you can look at my policies that I've passed. Everything that I've passed, I've been trying to utilize as a vehicle to improve the life of my community and to live out not just what I preach about every Sunday, but what I also vote on in the General Assembly, and also, what I wrote on in my dissertation. I literally wrote on what I lived through. And so for me, I'd love to have these conversations to also talk about how we empower other communities and to talk about how we can use even some policy that we've passed to be models for legislation across other states. Like in Tennessee, we have this thing in Tennessee where we have private HBCUs and also public HBCUs. Our private HBCUs were not getting much funding from the state because they're private. And so I was inspired because many of our private HBCUs are also church sponsored. So now, I passed legislation. All right, Terrence, I'm actually teaching a class at Physics and Political Science this fall. And so we passed legislation called the HBCU Initiative, right? And what it does now, it requires the state of Tennessee and all the departments to engage in the process of increasing the enrollment, the retention, and graduation rates of every HBCU, public and private, to the point now that we were able to get funding from one of our departments to provide $40,000 for our undergraduate HBCUs for a summer bridge program, right? And this summer bridge program allows them to take freshmen coming in the summer and orientate them to the college experience. So think about this. For the first time ever, we got Lane College and Lemoyne and Fisk University and American Baptist College with a bridge program sponsored by the state of Tennessee. Knoxville College, that was previously closed, is now open because the state of Tennessee got engaged in the process. For the first time in their history, you had a state official going on the campus of these private HBCUs, where it was all made possible because I married the Black church and public policy, because I was tired of the Black communities in the neighborhoods where those HBCUs were housed, not getting support from the state. And we also have this thing in Tennessee called the HBCU Wellness Project, which we use our HBCUs as a vehicle to have our students as student health ambassadors to go into the neighborhoods and do health assessments, and then to provide interventions based upon what research they found. This is, again, us using the Black church as a vehicle to transform public policy to improve the health outcomes of Black folks and the folks that look like us. And so this is what we're doing. So this is the practical, not the theoretical. This is the practical application of how we engage in policy making. So you got my information, email me. We'll work on processes to talk about how we can continue this conversation for the next 12 months. I love to do it. I love to have, whatever means we have. And I know LaKesha talked about continuing this process over the next month. And I'm open for it to talk about, this process, because we got to train our folks to be the next generation of those who continue this work. We got to duplicate this process. And one of the reasons I'm teaching at Fisk is because I want those Fisk students to have a class taught from the practical perspective of one who's engaged in the process. And so every year that I have interns, I bring them in and I have them walk with me literally as with writing legislation and prepare the pros and cons of how the bill can be passed and how it can be opposed, and then what's the effect on the community. And so for me, it's my upbringing in the Black church that informs me that I must do this work, and also engage my colleagues who are in the academy and my colleagues who are in the church setting to bring about change in these processes. And so for me, I can't say it enough, that I think this is the most opportune time for us to talk about how we can engage the Black church in public policy and look at how we can transform the members and those in the community to be empowered, right? To be empowered to speak truth to power and know that they're on the side of righteousness, to know that the story of Moses going to Pharaoh is the same as the church leader going to talk to the mayor, or the church leader going to talk to the governor, to talk about the fact that the man who's at the pool of Bethesda is our healthcare system. It's broken because everybody's sitting around waiting to see the doctor, and nobody can see the doctor on time. And to talk about how we can engage our health process to see more people, to expand Medicaid, and to have more folks have health insurance. And so for me, it's about seeing, again, the Bible through the lens of policy making, because the truth be told, Moses going and talking to Pharaoh was about living wage. Because really, Pharaoh said, you're going to work for nothing and build this pyramid for me and build this structure for me by making bricks without straw. That was an argument and a conversation about fair living standards and fair working standards. And so Moses comes in and said, listen, if you're not going to pay them what they're due, we're going to leave. See, that's the same thing we're talking about now. If corporations aren't going to pay our folks the living wage, we need to talk about how we're going to change policy. So for me, I see everything through the lens of what the Bible showed us. And that's what inspires us, because we can see that if people engage the public policy in the Bible, right, then we can talk about how we can engage public policy now. Again, whether it's healthcare, whether it's jobs and wages, or whether it's criminal justice reform. We got to find ways to break folks out of the prison, like the Holy Spirit got Peter out, right, and get them to do away with this money bail system. But the Black church has to step up. And so what I'm talking about is the fact that we have to be prepared to deal with these issues and to be empowered by the fact that at the end of the day, it's very important. The chains of oppression are often too weak to be felt until they're too strong to be broken. And we got to get out the place of ignoring these weak chains of oppression, because we're going to wake up one day and find that they bound us too strong. We can't get out of them. All right. So I think my time has come to an end right here for this session. But you got my contact information. Please reach out to me, and we'll be certainly glad to respond to you, and also to talk about this 12-month strategy program and communicating about how we can engage the Black church and public policy. All right. Thank you so much for attending, and for giving me some of your time this afternoon.